Alright, let's go ahead and get this party started. Welcome, class, to Classics 160B1. Meet the Ancients! Alright, as hopefully you know by now, I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today what we are doing is we are finally moving out of the terrifying Dark Ages and into the world of Archaic Greece. So let's go ahead and turn down the lights and fire up the projector. I've made our projector a little bit bigger today. I'll see if I can shrink myself accordingly. Let's see if this works here. Ah! Alright, that seems about right. You can see me? You can see the sun? We're good? We're good. Okay, so welcome to today's lecture 5.1 on the 8th century Renaissance. And if you speak French, you know Renaissance is French for rebirth. And what we are getting is a rebirth of both sophisticated material culture and complex society and culture. So after 400 years of Dark Ages, once again, we are on the rise here. So let's take a look at what we got on the docket. We'll start with a few announcements, then we will recap the Dark Ages, right? The Age of Heroes and that heroic tomb at the site of Lefkandi. And then what we'll do is we'll work through two different aspects of 8th century Greece. We'll look at both society, right? What's going on with population? What are some of the cultural traits that are developing? And then culture, right? Things like the Olympics and writing, that sort of thing. Things that are evolving during the 700s BC, the 8th century BC. And then if we have time at the end, what we'll do is we'll start to take a look at Archaic Greece more broadly and explain why we're getting some of the developments here. This is really where we take our first kind of leap into what we would traditionally consider classical Greece, right? It's not technically classical based on the time periods, but this is kind of where we get the birth of all those things that we associate with classical Greece and kind of the reason we study Greece in the first place. So we'll talk about that as we go along here. All right, so let's see what we got with our announcements today. All right, you guys know the deal. Go ahead and put this thing into speaker view. You can see me. You can see the slides. Hopefully with the bigger slides, you can read the slides and see the images on the slides. If you have questions as we're going through today's lecture, please go ahead and direct those to your TA, and they'll be able to help you out or funnel that question to me. Either way, we'll get you an answer one way or another. Don't you guys worry. And then finally, nothing is due this week on the research proposal, but a week from Friday is going to be when the first draft is due. It's not particularly long, but this is setting you on a path for the whole semester. Okay, so the better job you do here, not only will you get a better grade, but everything else that follows along that project is going to be better, and it'll kind of really set you up to succeed moving forward. All right, so let's go ahead and recap the Dark Ages, right? So remember, what we're seeing here is we're seeing a collapse of Bronze Age culture right around 1200 or 1100 BCE. And what that entails is a series of different things, right? So we lose the large central palaces at sites like Mycenae and Knossos, those disappear. Along with it, we imagine that the redistributive economies of the Bronze Age also disappear. And instead, what we're seeing, the kind of largest structures of the time are these kind of heroic burials. And the big one to know, the big one to write down and memorize for this class, right, is known as the Heroon at the site of Lefkandi. And so this is a 3D kind of model of what that might have looked like. Not quite on the same scale, right, as the palace at Knossos or the fortress at Mycenae, but a large tomb for one of the leaders of this city-state, okay? And when we look at all these different aspects of culture, we look at material culture and we see that kind of declining from the iconography of the Bronze Age to the geometry really of the Dark Ages. We look at social organization becoming less hierarchical. We look at economic ties fragmenting, right? So that the large-scale long-distance trade of the Bronze Age really isn't happening on the same scale anymore. And then architectural development, like you're looking at here, right? Like what we're getting with the Dark Ages at the Heroon is really a far cry from what's going on at sites like Knossos and Mycenae. So if you get a question down the road, I haven't developed what the essay question will be yet for the midterm, but if it was something in terms of how does culture change from the Bronze Age to the Dark Age, those are the types of things that you would want to discuss, right? Architecture and material culture and economic systems and site size and site frequency, all different types of evidence you could use to describe how things change between these periods. Now, at the site of Left Candy, right, what we think we're looking at is this heroic burial. And we see the deceased, there are actually two people in this tomb here, a man and a woman. We see them both kind of associated with militaristic armor. And then we see their horses buried with them, along with kind of some fine jewelry. And this is showing us that even though these economic networks are breaking down, they're not completely gone, right? So some of this jewelry is still finely worked. We get some heirlooms that were created hundreds of years earlier. And then we've got one of my favorite pieces here, this centaur guy, showing that even though most of the pottery is not like focusing on displaying humans or animals in iconographic form, we still do get at least a little bit of that at certain sites. Now, we think that when Homer was writing or composing these epics, right, whoever Homer actually is, he's drawing on some sort of mixture of culture from the Bronze Age along with culture from the kind of Dark Ages in the 8th century that he's a part of. And over the past 200 years, people who study classics have started to ask these questions about how that process worked, right? And we call these the Homeric questions, things such as, right, did the Trojan War happen? Who is Homer? Is he a real guy? Is he a single person? Is he a group of people? What is the total corpus of texts? We're not reading through all of them in this class, right? We're not reading through the entirety of the Iliad. But if you do, one of the things you're going to realize is that it doesn't tell the whole story of the Trojan War. This story takes place over the course of like 2 weeks out of a 10-year-long war. And so like what's going on with the rest of the story there? And then what we talked about last time, right? Were these sung? Were they written? Were they performed? That sort of thing. And what we talked about over the past couple classes were how we've developed some answers to these questions. So in terms of the real Homer, that's still a really tough one, right? As far as most classicists are concerned, there probably was not some dude named Homer wandering around Greece by himself writing down the Iliad and the Odyssey. The kind of more common hypothesis these days is that this is probably a group of different kind of oral poets going around to aristocratic houses and singing these kind of tales of heroism for these aristocratic families in exchange for money or goods or something along those lines. But it was, we think, sometime in the 8th century where the different stories that were being told coalesced into a single, into a kind of single coherent story. And so again, we don't really know whether Homer was a single real person or a group of real people or an imaginary person created later. But we do think, based on these kind of the oral poetry assessment of it, that it probably likely was a series of different stories coalescing around the 8th century. Now we think it's the 8th century, even though he's talking about sites like Mycenae and Tiryns and these massive Bronze Age citadels, because he loses it at certain points, right? He's trying to set it way back then in the age of like what you're looking at over there on the left-hand side of these boar's tusk helmets, which you only get in the Bronze Age and which we have evidence for from the site of Mycenae. But then he also lets slip some different kind of characteristics that he doesn't know as well. He doesn't remember, well, he obviously wouldn't have been alive, but like the cultural memory doesn't quite perfectly capture what was going on in the Bronze Age for everything. And so things like burials and stuff, sometimes you get people cremated, which is only something that's happening in the 8th century. That's not something that goes back to the Bronze Age. And then the big one we talked about on Friday, right? This debate about whether texts were originally written down. And there's good reason to think why that might have been the case. I mean, how in the world do you remember 15 hours worth of performance and be able to replicate that time after time after time, right? It makes sense that if you write it down, that's how the story is consistent from one telling to the next. But, right, then there are also sorts of little problems with that as well. For instance, we get these things called weak joins, which is these little problems in the text where maybe like a minor character dies twice. Or they have the same thing happen in two different parts of the story. And what we looked at last time was this guy, Milman Parry. He's the guy on the left over there. And he's a scholar of classics focused on Homer. And the way he investigated this story was by looking at other cultures around the world who have oral poets who tell super long epic poems. And in particular, he worked with this Yugoslavian guy who now is from modern day Bosnia, Avdo Majedovic. And he was telling or singing stories just as long as the Iliad. And what he learned from this is that the way this occurs is by building up two things. First, by building up these epithets. And epithets you can kind of think of like nicknames, but they take up different amounts of space. And then also by building formulas. So when you have certain parts of the story that repeat, like say a feasting scene or a battle scene, right? These are very, very common throughout the text. They always happen in the same sort of order. So you can kind of think of this like Legos of different sizes. Instead of having to build the whole thing out of 1x1 pieces, you can memorize a 2x4 piece, right? A larger piece. And you know that every time you need a feasting scene, you can plug that piece in there and it goes in the same order. And so we can see these things applied to what we call the meter of epic verse, epic poetry, which is dactylic hexameter. And if you listen to it, I'm terrible at reading like Greek out loud. It's just, I'm tone deaf and I stink at it. But it would go something like this if somebody knew what they were doing in terms of how to actually perform this orally. But it's like dum diddy dum diddy dum diddy dum diddy dum dum. Dum diddy dum diddy dum diddy dum diddy dum dum. And it goes like that, like time and again and time and again. And the way that those epithets fit in there is whoever you're talking about, you say a little bit about them, and then you use their epithet to fill in the end of the the meter up there, right? So if you have these two parts left, right, 5 and 6, foot 5 and 6, you use the one that takes up 2 feet. But if you have 4, 5, and 6, you use the one that takes up 3 feet. And a little piece of trivia along with this. The reason we call it dactylic hexameter, right? That might seem like a weird name, is actually because of this, right? It's named after your finger. And the idea is that you, in your finger, right, you've got these knuckle bones and you've got one long one right here. That's the long piece right there. And then you've got the 2 short ones. And those are the 2 little short ones there. So that's why we call it dactylic hexameter. It's named after your finger. 1 long knuckle followed by 2 shorts. And we saw examples of this as well, right? So we looked at Achilles and some of the different epithets associated with him, right? The son of Peleus, or swift-footed, or breaking through men. And one of the reasons we know that this was built in there as a device for memory, right? To be able to kind of freestyle the poem, but get the order correct and always be on rhythm, is that the meaning of each one of these doesn't necessarily match up to what's going on in the story at the time, right? So you might have Achilles breaking through men even if they're talking about him at a feasting scene. Or you might have like Achilles, shepherd of the people, while he's going through battle slaughtering everybody. So the content doesn't match up, right? What matches up is the meter to make this thing flow fluidly as somebody's performing it. So again, I love this story just because sometimes classical scholarship can be a little bit dry. And if you got placed in this class and you're like, I have no interest in the ancient world, and you're like, this is dry indeed. I feel you. But I do think this is like one of the coolest kind of approaches to studying ancient texts that I've come across in my study of classics. So that's why I spent some time on it. Okay, so that's kind of the what we know about Homer and how he's trying to focus back on the Bronze Age, but the Dark Ages in the 8th century leak into it a little bit. Now, we think that these were coming together and coalescing into a single repeatable story in the 8th century or the 700s BCE. And this is the same time when Greece is just starting to take off again. This is what we call the 8th century Renaissance, starting around 800 BC. And to really understand it, we want to start here. We're going to start here by talking a little bit about the Archaic Greek polis, okay? This is the beginning of the Archaic period, so if you're taking notes and you want any dates, right, what you should have kind of so far is like Bronze Age from about 3000 to 1200, Dark Ages from about 1200 to about 800, and then the Archaic period starting about 800 BC. Okay, that's our really rough start date for it. Now, here's the kind of general conception of Archaic Greece, right? When you think of Archaic Greece, I don't know, you think of something archaic, like people hunting woolly mammoths or living in caves or whatever, right? And I want you to take that and throw it out of your brain, right? Archaic Greece is not this, okay? Archaic Greece is the starting point for nearly everything that we associate with ancient Greece. When we think about Greek temples, when you think about the Parthenon's actually classical, but when you think about Greek temples that look like this is starting in the Archaic period. When you think about Greek democracy, right? Like that is maybe the single reason that Greece still plays such an important role today. That starts in the Archaic period. When you go to the museum and you're looking at beautiful Greek pottery here, right? This is a very famous vase called Ajax and Achilles playing dice. So it's a little quiet moment during the Trojan War where they're taking a break from battle and going to play a little gambling game inside their tent. But one of the most famous pieces of pottery, when we think of pottery that looks like that, really Greek pottery, that's archaic. And so what I want you guys to think about is when we think about Archaic Greece, right, we are thinking about a time of incredible innovation. Things haven't quite reached their peak yet, but all of that is starting during the Archaic period. Okay, now, one of the important things to keep in mind here is that when we think of ancient Greece, Archaic Greece or classical Greece or Hellenistic Greece, Bronze Age, really any version of ancient Greece, okay, we need to separate this out from modern Greece, right? Modern Greece is a country, right? It's a modern nation state. It's in southern Europe. It's just south of the Balkans up here, right? So this would be like former Yugoslavia that got broken up. Avdo Majedovic would have been like just north off the map here in Bosnia, up over here. But Greece is in southern Europe, right? It's just to the west of modern day Turkey. It's bounded by the Aegean to the east and the Ionian Sea to the west. Actually, it's the Ionian, and then if you get further, it's the Adriatic. Bounded by Crete in the south. But, you draw a hard line on there and you say, this is Greece on this side, and you cross over there and that's Albania. Two separate things. And this entire area, right, it's ruled by Athens. So Athens is right over here on the Attica Peninsula. And so the whole country has its capital in Athens. It's one coherent thing. Politically, it's all the same. Now take that, right? And along with your conception of the archaic, throw it out of your brain, get it out of your brain. And when we think of ancient Greece, we need to erase those lines, okay? So the modern nation state lines need to disappear. And what we need to think of instead is a much larger region. And we've got different cultures in this region. We've got different ways of doing things in this region. But instead of these hard, concrete borders that we get in the modern world, you need to think of these as really fuzzy boundaries, right? Where the people who speak Greek are bumping up against people who speak other languages, and they're flowing back and forth, and it's just not the same kind of hard and fast boundary that we get in the modern world. The other thing you need to do is when you think of even the center of Greece, right? We're going to talk in a second about how Greece is expanding out. But when you think of the center of Greece, it's not just the Greek mainland, right? Let's think of this whole area in red here as kind of the heart of ancient Greece. And it really is both sides of the Aegean. And so you're looking at modern day Attica, right, where Athens is, the Peloponnese where Sparta is, all the islands in the middle. So we've got Thera, right? That was the one that exploded during the Bronze Age. And then we've got Western modern day Turkey here. This is what we call Ionia in the ancient world, the ancient Greek world. This was known as the region of Ionia. It was Greek, right? There's no getting around it. This whole area is the center of Greece. Okay? So the goal here again is to kind of start reconceptualizing what our default image is when we think of this. So the Greek heartland is this whole area here. It's not something with a hard and fast boundary, just focused on kind of what the modern day country of Greece is. Now, if you're looking at all these other black little dots, these are Greek too. And we're going to talk about how in the 8th century, this is like what started happening as we started expanding out from the homeland to establish colonies all over the place. Now, here's one of the other big differences. Let's go back to this for just a second. Remember when we talked about the modern world, we talked about Greece being a coherent modern nation state with Athens at its center, being the capital city, ruling over everything else. When we look at the ancient world, all of these little dots are politically independent, okay? And so what that means is that Athens governs Athens, and Sparta governs Sparta, and Pithecusae, you're going to hear about that in a second, that governs itself. And so Miletus governs Miletus. So even though these are all Greek, and we consider them all Greek, politically, they're all separate. And just like think to yourself for a second, like what kinds of benefits and drawbacks that would have, right? I mean, you think about that. On the one hand, this would build an incredibly competitive ecology where city-states are both like sometimes teaming up, but frequently kind of at war with each other, culturally going to battle with each other to establish supremacy. Very, very competitive atmosphere here. So then the question, right, is like, all right, if we're looking at this world and all of these city-states are politically independent, like, why do we think of them as Greek, right? Like, why do we even like think of that as a coherent cultural entity? Why don't we just say Athenians and Milesians and Spartans? And that's because even though politically they're independent, all these city-states share some different cultural traits, right? And this is what we call Panhellenism, right? Pan meaning all. Hellas is the term for Greece, ancient Greece. And so Panhellenism is like the kind of things that all Greek city-states share. And one of those is language. Now, the dialect's different. And we talked a little bit actually with Homer that you can tell he was composing, or he might have come from Ionia, right, over in modern day Turkey, because that's the sort of dialect that comes through. But generally, right, even though these all have different dialects, they're all speaking more or less the same Greek language. Other things exist as well, right? So they're connected by economic networks, right? They like drinking wine. That's like food and drink are similar in these sorts of places. They have other cultural similarities like sport. And if you ever take my ancient athletics class, we'll dive into that about how, we think of sports in the modern world as kind of like, I don't know, a fun part of culture or something you do to take your mind off the real aspects of culture or something like that. In ancient Greece, and I would actually argue in the modern world too, but in ancient Greece, sport is a fundamental thing that makes a Greek, right? It's one of the things that you do, that you participate in, that kind of connects you with other Greek citizens. Warfare is very, very similar, and it differs from the type of warfare that you get in places outside of Greece. So we'll see actually when Greece goes up against Persia, the styles of warfare are extremely different. And then finally with architecture too, right? Architecture is another thing that binds the Greeks together. And also what goes on inside of the architecture, right? Religion is something that all the Greeks kind of share. And they may practice in slightly different ways. But if you go to Athens and you talk about Zeus, and you go over to the island of Sicily, to the site of Acragas, right, or Silenus, and you talk about Zeus, they're going to know what you're talking about, and they're like, oh yeah, he's throwing lightning bolts. So, even though they don't share a political government, they have a bunch of different traits that connect them as Greek city-states. And one of the things that connects them is the general kind of settlement pattern for Greek cities. And the term for this, right, is the polis. So that's the ancient Greek term for a Greek city. And when we think of a polis, what we want to think about is actually more or less kind of three different parts to a city. So on the one hand, what we've got like up top here, this is the Acropolis. So I could only find the image like in Italian, so the spelling's a little bit off, but the Acropolis is the high point of the city. And usually, it's not just Athens that has this. A lot of different Greek cities have some central part, usually a little bit raised, that's going to be kind of the religious heart of the city. And if you go up to the Acropolis in Athens today, that's what you're going to see. It's temple after temple after temple, a real center of religion for the city. Now, as you move down off the Acropolis, this breaks down very literally, right, to high point, like acro meaning high, like acrophobia, scared, like fear of heights, polis meaning city, so the high part of the city. When you go down though, right, you come off the slopes here, this is the Acropolis in Athens, you get to the lower part of the city. And the term for that in Greek is the asti, okay? So the asti is the kind of like regular part of the city where people live. So very closely connected to the Acropolis, but it's still urban. You still have kind of shops, you have houses, you have maybe little workshops, that sort of thing. And then surrounding all of that, you've got the chora. Okay, so the chora is the Greek term here. What that is, you can think of that as the hinterland. That's the farmland that surrounds the city. And even though, especially even in this class, right, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about Athens and Sparta and the monuments of the city that are inside the urban area. Again, kind of in your brain, if possible, try to keep in mind that like most people, we're talking like 80% of the people or something, are still living in farmland around the city, okay? So most people are still rural, even though it tends to be the urban monuments that we have preserved today. Okay, so that's how the polis is laid out in the ancient Greek world. And one of the other things that is kind of different from polis to polis is the type of government. So not only are they all politically independent, right? They actually have wildly different types of government. And so what we've got here is kind of a series of different types of government based on how concentrated the power is in a single person, right? How concentrated versus dispersed political power is. Now, what's going on in most of the world at this time, right? Or at least most of the world we've talked about so far. Egypt, the Near East. These are under monarchies. This is a rule by a single person, right? So like arche or archi, right, is the Greek term for like rule, and then mono, one, right? That makes sense. Ruled by one person, but it's one person, not just one person, but one person who inherited political power, okay? And that differs from tyranny. So if you've ever wondered the difference between like, why do we call it like the British monarchy, right? Instead of the British tyranny. Tyranny is actually a specific Greek term that also refers to somebody ruling, like a single person ruling, but this person has somehow seized power, right? So that's the key difference there. Monarchy is somebody who inherits it, right? Their dad was the king, and then their dad was the great granddad was the king, and you just go back and back and back. Tyranny is like somehow you're a new person who has kicked everybody else out, and you are now establishing yourself as the sole ruler of a given city-state. And what we're going to see is this actually happens in Athens in the 500s. And weirdly, like, it's not actually that bad of a time. It's a really prosperous time in the city-state. Okay, so monarchy and tyranny, two versions of single rule. Then we've also got oligarchy. And very literally, this is the rule of the few. Okay, so it's a small group of aristocratic rulership. And so we're moving out slightly from the monarchy to giving a group of people the ability to rule. And for most of the Archaic period, most of what we're going to talk about today, most of what we're talking about on Wednesday, oligarchy is the kind of most common version of government of these Greek city-states. Now, what we get at the end of the period is the advent of democracy. And that very literally breaks down as power. Think like Kratos, right? If you're a God of War fan out there. Power and of the demos, of the people, right? So very literally, it's the power of the people. And this is now, instead of just a small aristocratic group governing, this is all citizens of the city-state governing the city-state. Now, we'll see as we get into it, like we're not going to go overboard here when we talk about equality in terms of giving everybody power, because it's not everybody. But compared to what had come before it, it was a very different way of doing things. Okay, so what I'd like to do, let's go ahead and do our attendance for today. It's quiz number 9, February 8th. Go ahead and Heracles is looking very blue today. Maybe because it's Monday, I don't know. But go ahead and, go ahead and put in blue. I will start back up in a second or two here. Just have regular water today. It's awful. Now, so usually, right, the scope of the Monday, Wednesday, Friday is like I work out at some point in the morning, so I've earned the vitamin rain. That's why I drink for the rehydration. But I haven't worked out yet today, maybe because it's Monday. I don't know. But so I just have to drink regular old water, and it encourages you to work out. You got to earn the vitamin rain. I have not purchased the Celsius yet. I will, before the end of the semester, right? If I do it now, you guys have no reason to come to class. Later in the semester, sometime, it'll happen. Okay, let's dive back in here. And let's look at 8th century Greek society. What is going on socially during this period of time? So what ends up happening, part of what's going on in the 700s BC, the 8th century BC, is that there is another kind of small climate change, which makes like crops grow a little bit better. And that starts to kind of spur a population increase. And in Greece, this population increase is big enough that things get dense enough that different city-states start looking to move out from where they are and establish new colonies around the Mediterranean. We're going to also see that what happens now is the economy is totally different than what came both in the Dark Ages and in the Bronze Age, right? So in the Bronze Age, we had talked about these redistributive economies. In the Dark Ages, we talked about maybe market economies, but very, very localized for the most part, just staying within a very small realm. Now, with these emerging colonies, economic networks are once again spreading throughout the Mediterranean. And now it's under a kind of market-driven economy. And then one of the other things that we get is a division between church and state. And this is going to be important here. It's not exactly the same way we have a division between church and state in the modern world, right? It's not like political leaders would never talk about the gods or anything like that. But what I mean by it is that there's no monopoly on religion by the state. Okay? So if you were over in Persia at the time, the king in Persia, owns the religion as well. He's like a descendant of the gods. He has complete control of the religion. And in Greece, one of the very interesting things, right, is even though religion is intertwined with the workings of the state, the people ruling at any given time don't monopolize control over religion. And we'll see how that's important later on. Okay, so here's a good kind of map of the entire Mediterranean here, right? As well as the Black Sea up here. And what we're looking at in dark green, again, think of this is our kind of Greek homeland. Not just the modern day country, but kind of both sides of the Aegean Sea, as well as the islands. And so in the 8th century, this is kind of our starting point. And over the course of the next few hundred years, city-states in this region here start expanding out and founding other cities all over the Mediterranean. Now, one of the other things to keep in mind here is Greece isn't the only cultural group that's doing this at the time. We're not going to get into it in a lot of depth right now, but Phoenicia, the modern day, the Levant area of Israel and Palestine and Syria and Lebanon, that's very prosperous at this time as well. And their population is also growing, and they're also expanding across the Mediterranean. So they're founding cities all across North Africa here and even into southern Spain. And so they're the ones who actually found Carthage, which is going to play a huge role as we move forward with this course. Okay, so a time of expansion across the Mediterranean. Now, let's take a little deep dive into the first example of this in the Greek world. And so the first Greek colony is the site of Pithecusae, right? Very literally it translates as Monkey Island. Although there are other interpretations, but that's the one that I like. And it's on the modern Italian island of Iskia. And it was founded by Euboea, right? So Euboea, again, is this kind of island peninsula over here. That's where Left Candie was. So it's been kind of powerful from a very early time. And somewhere around 775 BCE, we get the people from that city-state sailing pretty far across the Mediterranean, getting over here and founding the first Greek colony. So here's a kind of Google satellite photo of the island of Iskia, you can see the one little part where the Greek remains are found up here in the north and the west. And what you can see when you start to actually look at the island, you can understand why they settled here, you know? You're like looking at this place and you're like, not a bad place to set up a colony. I've actually never been to the island of Iskia. If you look at the map, yeah, you can't really see it here, but we're like very close to the island of Capri and the Bay of Naples. Just a gorgeous, gorgeous area. We'll actually see the island of Capri later when we talk about, what is it? The early Roman Empire. Yeah, the early Roman Empire. So one of the early Roman emperors like builds a palace on the island, and that's getting off track. But the first Greek colony on the island of Pithecusae, beautiful, beautiful place. And we can see the archaeological remains here. These are all little houses. And so what you're looking at here, right? Like, these aren't sprawling Greek cities that are being founded at the beginning. Earliest one, 775, small collection of houses. So you might be looking at it and thinking, how in the world do you know that that's actually like Greek, right? I mean, there's nothing that screams like Greek from a collection of stones kind of in the shape of a house. Well, that's a great question. And you should always be thinking of these sorts of things, right? Like, how do we know the things that I'm telling you? Those are good questions, right? Do we know it from literature? Do we know it from archaeology? And in this case, it's a mix of all of that. So one is that like later Greeks call this the first colony, okay? So that later Greeks think it was the first. But there's other things as well. That cup of Nestor, the one where we have the earliest Greek inscription, that was found on the island. And we think that that dates to around 775. We also end up with Greek pottery, right? So in addition to being an inscription, this is also a Greek style of pottery. And then we also get a series of weights and measures. So one of the things that they need to do, right, when they're weighing out metal or something like that, they need standardized weights so that they can compare things. And they have these really cool ones in the shape of a duck, which is awesome. And so we have these Greek weights and measures from the island as well. So that's how we know, or that's what makes us think at least, that the island of Pithecusae, or the site of Pithecusae, was the first Greek colony. Now that's just the first of many. What we're looking at here, so we see Pithecusae up here to kind of orient you. This is modern day Bay of Naples. And what we're looking at, all of these things are Greek colonies. The Greeks love the island of Sicily, and they love southern Italy. And they get so many Greek colonies here that we actually call this Magna Graecia, or like Greater Greece. Because it is like, you know, we need to, again, rip off the modern nation states from this. This is no longer the country of Italy. This is a region hugely populated by Greeks. And we can actually see sites like Neapolis, right? Neapolis. That becomes modern day Naples, right? That's where we get the word. So if you've ever had Neapolitan pizza or Neapolitan ice cream, and you're wondering why it's not like Napolitan, it's because it's based on the Greek name for the city-state there. Okay, so that's what's going on in terms of society. People are spreading out across the Mediterranean. And one of just kind of trivia-based things, they actually formed two sorts of colonies. So they have like formal colonies that are going to be full-fledged city-states of their own. And then they also have what they call emporia, right? Or an emporion in the singular. And if you've ever been to an emporium, right, a little shop, like that's where we get the word from. And an emporion in the Greek world it's almost like a not kind of full-fledged city that's mainly there for economic purposes. You can almost think of it as a large trading post. So they set up both of those. And then whichever city-state founded those, we call that city-state, makes sense here, a metropolis, right? Which very literally translates as the mother city, right? Metro, like coming from meter, like mother, and polis, meaning city. metropolis, the mother city of a given colony or an emporion. Okay, so culturally, what I want to highlight here is, again, many of the things that we associate with ancient Greece more generally get started during the 8th century and in the Archaic period. So one, we're going to get the Olympics, we're going to get art, we're going to get temples, we're going to get the alphabet. So let's go ahead and kind of quickly go through these here. We get the first Olympics right around the same time as the first colony. So traditionally, this is dated to 776 BCE. It was only a single event at the time. Again, you can learn more about this in my ancient athletics class. It was just one sprint. But this was really important because what the Olympics did, it gave people a place to come together and compete kind of peacefully. Remember, all those city-states are independently governed. They're all competing with each other. And in the Olympics, you can come together to do something unified and peaceful. It was won by this guy, Coroebus of Elis. He was a baker, and he was the fastest guy. We get our earliest Greek temples during this period. So we don't actually have any of the temple itself left, but this is a model, a little like terracotta, a clay model of what a temple looked like. And this is very different than religious structures that had come before it. And what you end up seeing before it, what you get are these open air altars. Now what you have is you have something that looks very similar to a house. And in fact, that gives us a sense for what's going on. The temples of ancient Greece, these are very literally the house of the gods. So this isn't quite to our version with all the stone columns. We'll see that next week or next class on Wednesday. But we're getting to that with these kind of house or temples that look like houses. Art is making a big old comeback, right? So remember, we got our awesome octopus vase from the Bronze Age. When we get into the Dark Ages, right? Again, it's got kind of a cool, modern, minimalist aesthetic. This is what we call proto-geometric pottery of the Dark Ages. But in the early Archaic period, we are back, baby. All right? We have got people, we've got animals. You can see here, this is known as the Diplon crater. You can see this is showing the funeral rites of somebody up here, and then they've got the chariots down here, people mourning the deceased. We have got iconography once again. And then we've got writing, and we've talked about how important writing is. And what we see is that Greek writing, right, is actually borrowed from the Phoenicians over here. So in this column, you can see the Phoenician alphabet, and then how that gets adapted to the Greek alphabet over here. And what's really cool is the Phoenician alphabet, you go back even further, that comes from the kind of cursive version, hieratic, of Egyptian hieroglyphs. And the hieratic, the cursive version, comes from the original one. So when you're looking at this eagle in hieroglyphs in Egypt, right, it gets translated into something that looks like that, which gets translated into Phoenician looking like that, which gets translated into Greek looking like an alpha, which just happens to look exactly like our letter A. And so you can see that this is not a wholesale Greek invention, but it's borrowed from the Phoenicians who borrowed it from the Egyptians. And what we'll see, we'll kind of jump to the end here now, but what we end up seeing, the really important thing here, is that what we're getting is completely different than what came before it in Greece. What came before were administrative records. Now we have got epic poems. We are storytelling. So we will start talking more about that next class on Wednesday. Let's go ahead. What do I want you doing for Wednesday? I want you starting to read Herodotus. That's what you're reading for this week's reading response. Go ahead and dive into that. He is storytelling as well. History in Greek, historia, is actually our word for stories. And so go ahead and begin that. Let's go ahead and bring up the projector and turn on the lights. I hope you all have a wonderful couple of days, and I will see you back here on Wednesday. All right, have a good one, everybody. Good seeing you.